Sir Jacob, welcome to the IEA podcast.
Always a pleasure to visit the IEA.
Well, welcome back. There are lots of reports, and you've talked about this on your GB News programme, that businesses, millionaires, wealth creators, indeed lots of ordinary Britons are looking for the exit. They're fleeing overseas, whether it's because of high taxes, low growth, or whatever. My first question, perhaps a slightly cheeky one, how much of this do you put down to what Labour has done since they came into power? How much do you think we can attribute to a record of failure, or let's say underperformance by the Conservatives in government over 14 years? And how much of it is just that we are stuck in a rut economically?
Oh, I think it's mainly to do with the fact that the Treasury is one of the great burdens on the British state, that it's hard to think of a worse organisation in this country, one that has failed us more badly, or has given worse advice to chancellors. And if you look at all the changes made to non-dom status, starting with George Osborne, compounded by Jeremy Hunt, and then really finished off by Rachel Reeves, this has been an anti-growth, anti-business policy promulgated by the Treasury. And it's been terrible. It's such a stupid thing to do. One can have respect for one's political opponents when they do things that don't work, that they do for strong, principled reasons, and they feel they have a good intellectual case for. But the case for attacking non-doms is very weak. It's obviously weak, and it ends up being an act of self-harm. You have a choice. Do you want in this country billionaires, centimillionaires, multimillionaires who owe no loyalty to this country but spend money here, employ people here, pay VAT here, contribute to economic growth through their investments here, or do you not? If you want them to be here, you have to make their tax system one that they think is fair, so they pay tax in India on their Indian investments, or in the United States, or whatever it is. You don't try and squeeze them until the pipsqueak, because if you do, you find they go. So I think it's been terrible policy, led by the Treasury, which is the sort of mainstay of the blob in this country, that has done enormous economic damage.
So you put it mostly down to the non-dom issue. With the non-dom question in particular, do you think it's mostly about the inheritance tax aspect of that, bringing overseas investments and wealth and so on into the inheritance tax net, or is it a broader thing than that?
Oh, I think it's the broader approach to attacking their overseas income and investments, rather than allowing them to maintain those separately from their domestic ones. But the death duties aspect is the sort of final cherry on top, that people who aren't actually British should not be expected to pay British death duties. And of course you'd leave if you're very rich and you're facing a 40% tax on your wealth.
I mean, I've always thought that, the non-dom tax status was quite easy to justify practically for the reasons you've outlined, perhaps rather harder in principle, because I suppose as a free marketeer, I generally think that the tax system ought to be neutral. It should apply to everybody kind of equally. But perhaps the point there should be, why don't we treat everyone as a non-dom effectively? Why don't we just tax income where it's earned, or consumption where it's earned, or investments where they're made?
Well, we did up until about the 1970s. And then people working for multinational companies started fiddling it. So it became essentially a tax avoidance protection. So what happened was that chairmen of conglomerates that had overseas entities started being paid by their overseas entity, which was essentially bogus. And therefore the law was changed to cover all your earnings if you were British. I accept your point that tax should be neutral. I think this is very important. But tax is not, in fact, a moral issue. Tax is an issue about how do you grow the economy and how do you raise the revenue that you need. And you've got to recognise that there is some tax that is voluntary. And non-doms subject themselves to voluntary taxation. And it's why many countries are willing to say to non-doms, if you pay us £200,000 a year, we're not interested in the rest of your tax status. And you can buy that because you don't have any obligation to the country. And I think that's fine, because they're not British and it is different. They're not necessarily able to vote. Some of them may be Commonwealth citizens who pick up a vote, but if they're Greek, we had a lot of Greek shipping people here. They never had the vote in our elections. They didn't benefit from the protection of a British passport if they were travelling abroad. Not that that's necessarily much use to them, but they weren't part of the civil life of obligation to the country.
Okay, so that's a good point. We're talking here obviously about the very wealthy and the internationally mobile. I suppose what we're also seeing, though, is lots of ordinary Britons thinking about moving overseas. So they might be recent graduates, they might be docked.
Okay, I don't like the term ordinary Britons because I don't think my fellow subjects are ordinary. I think they are fantastic British people.
Okay, that's a fair point. Extraordinary, but...
There's wonderful British people
Yeah.
who don't like being ripped off by a rapacious HMRC.
But you have, let's say, healthcare workers moving to Australia. You have famously lots of, say, beauticians and hairdressers moving to Dubai, among many others. This seems to me less about, well, it's obviously not about non-dom status in this case. That's about something about Britain more generally. The tax system, the tax burden.
I'm not sure about hairdressers because every high street shop now seems to be a barber's shop for reasons that mystify me.
Well, we may not go into those reasons now. I'd like to get to the bottom of it too.
How many times do people have their hair cut? But leaving that to one side, of course, if you tax people too highly and there are business opportunities elsewhere, they will, if they can, and if they're very motivated, go abroad to find other opportunities. They'll also stop maximising their earnings. When I was still an MP, I had a constituent write to me saying that he had a choice between a job paying him £80,000 a year and one paying £110,000 or £120,000 a year. He was going to take the lower paid one because the increase in pay was almost all eaten up with tax because he had children, so he lost various benefits to pay for childcare and so on, and he would have a lot of extra work to do for a marginal increase in standard of living. So he wasn't going to do it. So we have a very poor tax system at the margin, and the failure to get the 45p rate down to 40p was a mistake. The fiscal drag that has brought so many people into the 40p rate, who, at least if they're living in London, are in no sense rich, has been a disincentive to work. And we also have a benefit system that means people can be better off on benefits. And the work Fraser Nelson did, who interviewed a lady who would need to earn £35,000 a year to be better off working than on benefits. So, yes, there are all sorts of problems that discourage people to work in this country.
So what do you think we do about this? And maybe I'll just to preface that question slightly. The last one of these interviews I did was with Paul Johnson from the IFS. And one of the things I asked him to talk about was a point he's made frequently, which is that the Conservative governments from 2010 to 2024, actually, they made the tax system much more progressive because they were raising the personal allowance for most of that period and taking people out of the tax net. Simultaneously, they maintained high top rates of tax and they kept that higher rate threshold very low. So actually what you got, maybe contrary to the caricature, but maybe it's also not good economics, was the tax system becoming much more weighted towards the better off. But anyway, do you sort of recognise that description of what happened when Conservatives were in government? And if you had the chance again, what sort of approach would you want to take?
Well, I wasn't always supportive of the tax policy
No, indeed.
we were following. I mean, I was as vocal as I could be within the confines of collective responsibility when we increased corporation tax, which I thought was a completely stupid idea. I opposed it in the cabinet, and I gave those coded messages that people give that indicate they're not entirely happy with something when they're remaining within a government. That was a really silly mistake because actually cutting corporation tax raised more revenue, both in cash terms and as a percentage of GDP. That was once again Treasury orthodoxy, Treasury modelling, saying you would raise more money by putting a rate up, which wasn't necessarily true. I don't think saying something is progressive is a compliment. I have no wish to be a progressive. I'm a conservative. I believe in conserving what is good, and I believe in an economic policy that makes everybody richer. And I think excessive taxation of the better off doesn't make everyone richer because they work less or they leave. And we are squeezing people who are doing the best for themselves. So people on £100,000 a year, the marginal tax rates there are absolutely crippling and make it hardly worth working at that level. Some of the rates are infinite, actually. With some of the withdrawal rates, you go from £99,999.99p to 100,000. Rumph, you lose all sorts of benefits that make you significantly worse off. So I don't think it's been a clever thing to do. I think the problem is that we didn't actually cut enough during austerity. We carried on with too big a state. And we've got to look at where we're wasting money. Look at what Trump's doing. Just get rid of overseas aid. We could get rid of UKRI, which is extraordinarily wasteful. For 7 weeks, I was in charge of it and discovered that it hardly spent a penny sensibly. We could stop carbon capture and storage. We should stop the Bank of England's QT, which it is doing in a way that no other central bank is doing, at a cost of tens of billions of pounds to the exchequer. So we need lower taxes, but to get that, and I'm sure Paul Johnson pointed this out, you need low expenditure too.
Sure.
And the thing we often fail to do is say, where is that lower expenditure coming from? This year would have been a very good year to freeze benefits because inflation last September was low, the increase was low, the difference you would have made would not have been great, but the saving would have been worth having. You want to get back to, the Minister for Government Efficiency, I was looking at this, massive cuts to the civil service, which is ridiculously bloated. So I'm not just sitting here saying, let's cut taxes, let's have unfunded tax cuts. I'm saying we need to reduce the size of the state. The state needs to do less and therefore spend less. It needs to change the disincentives so that you should not be incentivized to be on welfare rather than in work, and then you can afford to cut taxes. And you also want to structure your tax system to do the least economic harm. And here you come into the capital taxes area, which I think are the most damaging taxes. So death duties should simply be abolished. The damage that will be done by Labour's changes to small businesses are terrible because the average return for a manufacturing company is 7.1%. If you therefore charge 20%, that is 3 years of profits to pay the tax. But you pay the tax on dividend, you don't pay it on the profits from within the company. So you're actually talking about 6 years of profits before you pay that 20% tax. Nobody in their right mind will invest in a small business, a family business, even a big family business. On that basis, they will simply sell up. But farming, it's even worse because return on capital in farming is even lower. So capital taxation needs reforming because it's very damaging economically. Capital gains tax is difficult because you need to try to stop diversion between income and capital gain, which clever people can do. And I'm not clever enough, but clever people know how to do it. And capital gains tax really exists as an anti-avoidance measure. It's not a good tax otherwise. Again, it's a voluntary tax, so you never have to sell the asset. So if capital gains tax is too high, people don't sell the asset. And therefore the only way it falls, really, is on disguised income because people have to take that effectively. And then you've got income tax that is too high. So you need to look at how you can afford the expenditure that you must have, cut what you don't need, and then fund it from a tax system that maximizes economic growth.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, let's talk about, I'd like to hear more about some of the tax cuts, but the spending cuts, which should come first. Now, obviously, you were Minister of State for Government Efficiency, I think only for 7 months as the Boris Johnson government was sort of falling apart. So we can't blame you for perhaps some of the efficiencies that persist after your time in the department there. But I mean, had you had longer, and maybe you just outlined some of the things you'd have looked at, but I suppose strategically or structurally, how would you have proceeded? Would it have been a sort of Musk-esque Doge effort? Would it necessarily have been quite different in the British context? But I mean, how could you really have delivered much leaner government? And I think, as you pointed out, it has to be about the government doing less, doesn't it? Not simply doing it more efficiently.
Well, that's right. We were looking at, and I was speaking to Francis Maude, who'd done an excellent job for David Cameron on reducing the size of civil service. We had a programme that was starting in the Cabinet Office and was going to be rolled out across government to reduce civil service by 90,000 to get it back to the pre-pandemic levels. That then get lost in the changes of administration that we had. We were going to do things that really annoyed the blob, at great squealing from the blob. It was the one time civil servants really tried to obstruct me, was over cancelling the fast stream. We were going to get rid of the fast stream. That was going to save taking on 4,000 people a year. Not huge in the context, but actually the fast stream system didn't work very well. And it would seem to me it was ridiculous to be taking on new people when you were trying to reduce your numbers. The squealing was unbelievable. I also wanted to get people back to work, getting into the office. And that was beginning to happen. I noticed the then Cabinet Secretary said he'd told me to stop sending out notes. This was absolute nonsense. He never mentioned my sending out notes to me at all. It was in the Civil Service magazine, so essentially straightforwardly untrue. I was very surprised that the former Cabinet Secretary would say something untrue.
Yes. Okay, so that all will help, right? But I suppose the other thing is you've got these huge age-related liabilities of the state at the moment. So I think the OBR predicts that, I know the OBR is not one of your favourite institutions.
Well, the OBR is useless. Choate, I thought, was excellent and got his job properly. Since he went, it's been a dreadful organisation that's forecasts are dreadful, unbelievably bad. It was £15 billion out on its forecast for the last year, a month before the year end. And this is routine incompetence. This isn't an organisation that makes the odd mistake. Over the year as a whole, I think it was out from start to finish by over £60 billion.
Well, so maybe so. Nevertheless,
use it as, and actually, it's even worse now. Its report on immigration, where it said what are the economic benefits of migration, was straightforwardly dishonest because it excluded dependents. And so it said, immigrants are net contributors. Read the small print. If we exclude dependents, well, when you've got a huge number of dependents coming, that's ridiculous fantasy land. It's a very bad organisation.
However,
all right.
Their analysis of long-term fiscal risks. Now, I'm using this because it's the most convenient number to use. Other people have looked at the same thing and come to similar conclusions. But I think over the next 50 years, they predict that on current policy setting, so without changing anything, without making the benefit system or the way we treat retirees more generous, we're going to need about an extra, I think it's 11% of GDP in tax revenue to pay for pensions, for social care. I think you've written about social care in the past, for healthcare for the elderly and so on. And I suppose the argument you would hear from those who maybe they don't favour higher taxes, but they think higher taxes are inevitable and necessary, is that we can do all of these things that you're talking about that we might agree with. But when you have this looming tidal wave, taxes are going to have to go up whatever happens. What do you say to that? Is there a way out of this long-term dilemma, at least one which is consistent with democratic politics?
Well, I was once very privileged to come to an event here that you had with Arthur Laffer, and I'm very privileged that I should be having dinner with him on Thursday evening. And I will point to him that actually if you put taxes up endlessly, you end up getting less money and you can pay for less. You also have no economy on which to do it. It's a bit like Henry VIII's comment about John Fisher, the Pope may make him a cardinal, but he will have to wear his hat upon his shoulders, for he will have no head to put it upon. That if we decide to keep on raising taxes, we will have no heads to put our economic hat upon. So I think that just doesn't work, that thinking that you can put taxes up to fund 11% of GDP increased expenditure and get tax going up to 50% of GDP is ridiculous. That if you look at tax percentage of GDP post-war, it peaks at about 38%. It's almost impossible to get it above that level, even when tax rates are 98%. You don't get it when it's 98%. It's actually well below the maximum level. The maximum level until now was under Margaret Thatcher, when the economy was growing and tax rates hadn't yet fallen, when she was getting the public finances in order to cut taxes. That's when we peak, because there seems to be some inbuilt issue with the system that makes it very, very hard to raise tax above 38% of GDP. And I know in some other countries it's different, but that seems to be where it reaches its ceiling here. So I don't think endlessly raising taxes is realistic. You have to get economic growth. To get economic growth, you need lower taxes. To get lower taxes, you need to be doing less. Now, how do you deal with the extra costs? First of all, examine what they are. That one of the things about increased longevity is that people are finding increased longevity in much better health. I noticed this as an active Conservative, that the people who were doing deliveries for us when they were 60, 20 years ago, are now still doing deliveries for us aged 80. They're not all in hospital wired up to machines, whereas 20, 30, 40 years ago, 80-year-olds were elderly and frail. Now 80-year-olds are remarkably fit and active. So you don't have all the costs in exactly the way that you expect, because better medicine and better preventive medicine and wonderful things like statins, which allow me to stuff my cholesterol to the limit with all sorts of delicious food and then keep it under control, help. So that's part of it. The care people need is delayed until they're older too, so that's another part of it. But there's a real issue with pensions, and I think you need to look at whether the state can carry on giving one class of people gilt-edged pensions, which nobody else has. So I think the state should move away from defined benefit pensions for the civil service and put them onto defined contribution as everybody else is. I think you need to raise the retirement age. Yeah. The retirement age needs to rise in accordance with people's health. What was the pension age when the state pension came in? 70. It's actually lower now than it was when Lloyd George brought it in.
And there weren't many 80-year-olds out pamphleteering in those days, right?
In 1900, Whitaker's Almanac printed a list of all the distinguished 80-year-olds in the country. Now, topped, of course, by Her Majesty the Queen. It's rather splendid how Whitaker's did this. Now, if they tried doing that, the whole book would be taken up by a list of people aged over 80.
Yeah.
Distinction and merit, or however they defined them. So yes, you've got many more, and that becomes unaffordable.
So we've talked about you being Minister of State for Government Efficiency. You were also Minister of State for Brexit Opportunities. Looking back, how well do you think we seized on the opportunities of Brexit? And if the answer, as I suspect it might be, is that we didn't do all that well, what are the big opportunities that are still there to be seized with the political will?
The great frustration about the change in government that took place when Boris left, and I was a great supporter of Boris's anyway, was that a lot of the work that we were doing on the Brexit opportunities then got wasted. And the Sunak government was, I'm afraid, very poor about this, that we had the repeal of retained EU law bill, which was introduced, I introduced to Parliament, and then the Sunak government came in and completely gutted it, which was a terrible missed opportunity. It means we're still stuck with all sorts of EU regulations. So there's much more that could have been and should have been done. So I'm strongly in favour of doing that. We have the free trade deal with Australia and New Zealand. We should be looking at removing tariffs on those goods we don't produce. You know, we still have tariffs on oranges.
Yeah.
Which even in Somerset we don't grow that many. All of that. We still, and we're having the reset with Europe at the moment, which Starmer wants. This is absolutely idiotic because we run our food and agricultural system to subsidise the European Union. So we export about £15 billion worth of food and agricultural produce to the EU. We import nearly 50 billion, 47 billion, 3 times as much. And we have EU regulations and therefore EU pricing that are an effective subsidy of the British consumer to the European producer. And we have kept these post-Brexit, and Starmer's about to make it even worse. This is really silly policy. We want to be importing from the rest of the world good quality food and agricultural produce that would actually be much cheaper. We are paying a penalty for European closeness, and we should give up on that.
Including, presumably, an American
Of course,
deal.
including American.
Chlorinated chicken notwithstanding.
Do you eat salad?
If I have to.
My
wife makes me.
Right, I don't eat salad. I don't like it. But the reason I don't eat it isn't because it's chlorine washed.
No.
But salad is chlorine washed in the UK.
Yeah.
Do you like salmonella?
Not much.
No, nor do I. No. Chlorine wash gets rid of salmonella. It's good stuff.
I eat a lot of chicken when I'm in America, mind you.
Yes,
so there we are.
And you survive
somehow.
It's It's pure protectionism. There's nothing wrong with chlorine wash. It's not unsafe. I don't swim very much, but if you go swimming, you swim in chlorine. Actually, our tap water has chlorine in it.
Yeah. There we are. You've talked about the blob. If you get a reformist, and notice the ist on the end of that, a reformist government coming in, wanting to do quite radical free market things, roll back the frontiers of the state and so on, do you think that, are you just using the term blob colloquially, or do you think there is a real problem there, a kind of inbuilt resistance within the government system that will prevent you from pursuing a free market agenda?
Oh, no. A government that wants to do things can do it. The levers of government are still there. They rusted. You see, well, the blob, the quangocracy, all made sense whilst we were in the European Union. So you have these bodies that were answerable to the Commission because they implemented Commission regulations. If you took Natural England, it was implementing EU law because all of the regulations it had were EU law, not domestic law. So you didn't need a minister because minister couldn't do anything anyway. He couldn't change EU law. What we've done is we've unplugged it from the EU, and you've now got the wire that's sort of flapping about in the wind. It's not plugged into anything. It's not responsible, accountable to anybody or anything. And that can be changed by legislation. Parliament is still supreme. The supremacy of Parliament was clearly established once again in the judgment on Rwanda, the Supreme Court judgment on Rwanda, which Bill Cash told me is why I know the paragraph 144, says in no uncertain terms that the courts do not have the power or the desire to overrule clear legislation. So Parliament can do things. We can get rid of the Human Rights Convention. We can go back to the system we had prior to 1972 of Dyson parliamentary sovereignty. It needs a government that knows what it wants to do and then gets on and does it. It needs a government that works out how to operate through cabinet government, which hasn't really happened properly since Tony Blair. But all these things can be put back. The levers of power are there, they're just a bit rusty.
Yeah, interesting. And I think particularly on this sort of legal side that you're talking about, the Human Rights Act, and a whole host of things going back decades, which have kind of tied the government up in its own form of red tape, I suppose. Actually, there's nothing wrong with limits on government power, but you do want the government to be able to do things that it has a democratic mandate to do. I suppose that's the point, isn't it?
Yes. I highlighted the one thing where the civil service was deliberately obstructive and tried to stop a decision that had clearly been made and behaved really quite disgracefully about it on the fast stream. But most of the time, when the civil servant came to you and said, "Minister, you cannot do that," it was because we had passed a law that meant you couldn't do that. So Human Rights Act needs to go, Equality Act needs to go, Climate Change Act needs to go. If you get rid of those three, then you can begin to govern again. Because those are the things that people use to take the government through the courts for an endless judicial review to stop perfectly reasonable decisions being made. But they are all laws that Parliament passed.
So those three would be the starting point.
Well, and the constitutional reforms of Blair. So I'd put the Supreme Court back in the House of Lords.
Right. Okay. And I suppose you would pick up the agenda that you left off when you were Minister for Brexit Opportunities of guillotining or sunsetting all of that EU law.
Oh, of course.
Removing the precedent as well they've set with an English law.
Absolutely crucially.
Yeah.
Anything that Starmer agrees now, an incoming Conservative government should now be promising to pull out of. Doesn't matter what it is. Any free movement of young people, forget it. We should pull out of that. We should cancel it. If they're given a single extra fish after 2026, we should take it back. We should not be bound by this type of reversal of Brexit by stealth, and I would really encourage the Conservatives to be clear about that as possible.
Presumably, though, there are things that the government could agree with the EU that you'd be in favour of and wouldn't want to reverse?
Can you think of an example?
I mean, the trade could be freer, for example. Well, in many respects, we could move some of the non-tariff barriers to trade.
We haven't imposed non-tariff barriers. I constantly opposed us imposing non-tariff barriers. They put non-tariff barriers on us. If they want to take them off, that's fine.
Okay.
We should also scrap the Windsor Framework, which is quite a disgraceful way of treating Northern Ireland.
Does it open a big can of worms to sort of unpick things to do with Northern Ireland? I mean, this was always one of the big sticking points. People always said, hadn't you thought about Northern Ireland before?
Yes, we had. And it was all done hopelessly by Theresa May's administration. It was their problem, not ours.
So leave it essentially to the European Union. And
the European Union wants to build a wall across Ireland. That's a matter for it. It was never our business. I could never understand this. Why were we trying to solve the EU's problem? I don't care about the European single market. It's not my problem to solve smuggling in Ireland. I don't care two hoots. That's their problem. The Irish problem, and I don't think the Irish government would have let them build a wall. We should have called.
Well, I suppose that's the crucial point. It was a bluff that could have been called.
It should have been called, and I'd still call it.
Yeah.
I really don't think we should care about the EU single market. It is not our business. It's their problem.
All right. So moving on. You've written for the IEA.
I have.
Asked Jacob. I also hold this one up to the camera. Raising the Roof, How to Solve the UK's Housing Crisis. I think this was from 2019.
Absolutely. It was about a week before I got into government. I think,
okay.
I perhaps knew what was going to happen. So some inkling from Boris what his plans were. And I think Dr. Radomir Talcott and I were saying to the people in charge of publication, can you get it out quickly? Because, of course, if I'd been in government, I would then not have been able to put it out. So there was we were getting quite close to the deadline.
But so this is a sort of radical liberalising approach to the planning system and trying to make it easier to build the houses that we need in response to market demand in the UK. How high a priority for you is that, politically and economically?
Oh, look, I think it was the great failing of the 2019 to 24 Conservative administration that we've increased the population through immigration. We have an extra need for houses because family sizes tend to get smaller, and we have provided, since the Town and Country Planning Act 1947, a type of housing that people don't actually want. We are the only major economy where the size of properties in square foot terms has declined, and where the outdoor space has also declined. When you ask people in opinion polls what do they want, they say 70% say they want a house with a garden. And we have increasingly shrunk the size of the house and of the garden. And we've tried to offer them tower blocks, which they don't want. So what I would like to see is housing supply that meets the demand that people have. I think people also want beautiful housing. I think governments and architects want to give them housing that they, the politicians and architects, don't themselves want to live in.
Right.
We all want to live in nice Georgian rectories, and we expect our voters to live in tower blocks. And the planning system encourages that. It encourages density and it encourages height. The percentage of land in the country that's built over is remarkably small. People ought to look out the window when they fly into Heathrow and see the amazing amount of green space, even in the built-up area of the southeast of England. There is an enormous amount of green field around. There is plenty of space to build what people want, and a garden, to my mind, is just as much a green space as a field. Indeed, it may be better for nature in some respects. Not that I'm a wild green, in case you were getting worried. I think beauty is what the market demands, and we have a system that currently is fundamentally unbeautiful. It's sort of Soviet in its desire not to have beauty. No one would be allowed to build the Royal Crescent in Bath under current planning rules. You would never get agreement for it. And yet, if we look at the buildings that we love, they are the older ones that were built to meet a market. And so that's what we should do. We should be more market-focused, more beauty-focused, more recognising the needs of individuals, and less bureaucratic. And that means moving away from a very complex planning system, very expensive planning system. We need to move away from all the loony environmental regulations, concern about bats and newts and so on, that actually, if you're building properly, the bats will cope. They'll find somewhere else to roost. And so we need a simplified system, provides what people want, and we need it to happen in sufficient numbers that you actually moderate the price of housing, which has got unaffordable for too many people.
Now, presumably you don't have a problem with density, big cities, if it's market-led, if the demand is there and developers want to put up tower blocks, as you say, or at least they could even be beautiful mansion blocks. Is that that's consistent with your vision that you're
I think
outlining.
they're consistent.
Here.
Don't know. Mansion blocks are very popular, and particularly the ones in London. Pimlico has some of the greatest density of anywhere in the United Kingdom, and it's very nice terraced houses, stucco-fronted terraced housing. It's very attractive. Parts of Kensington also very high density terraced housing. So you can get density, and people do want that in inner cities, but people also want the garden, what the garden suburbs, the village, they like villages too, but they like the slightly more space and more garden that you get slightly further from London or from big cities.
Yeah.
Then they should have that if that's what they want.
Well, quite. And
I like Jordan rectories, and therefore I should be,
a Georgian rectory for everyone. That might be hard to achieve.
It may be, and not everybody wants precisely what I want. But I think conceptually, people do want the same. That is to say, what do most people want? They want more space inside and outside. It's what I want, it's what you want.
Yeah.
And we mustn't assume that we want that because we're top Tory toffs. They, of course, are apolitical, running a charity.
Yeah.
And that everyone else wants something second rate. They don't. They want the same as top Tory toffs.
Yeah. Yeah. So what went wrong? 2019, I mean, I can remember saying, I think it was on an IEA podcast long before I worked at the IEA, if this government achieves nothing else, at least they're going to liberalise the planning system. And that will be a sort of truly historic victory with huge impact. And of course, it was a great disappointment. I mean, I suppose there was a by-election and maybe the political will or the political courage fell away. Or do you think that there were mistakes in the way that the whole issue was tackled?
It went wrong very early on. The structure of the legislation went wrong. That the Department of Communities and Local Government turned out not to be any good at writing legislation, which was a serious problem. It claimed at one point not to have enough lawyers to write the legislation, which for a government department was a pretty odd thing to claim. There was this proposal to have an algorithm that was going to decide where building was going.
A mutant algorithm.
I mean, that was just daft. It was neither radical enough to get the job done, whilst at the same time it was not unradical enough not to worry people. So you've got maximum worry with least perceived benefit through the bill. So the bill basically got changed and then taken over by Michael Gove and made no real planning changes, but made some pretty disagreeable other changes on things like compulsory purchase, which were fundamentally unconservative. So we actually made things worse in 5 years rather than better.
Perhaps there's a lesson there that if you're going to do something controversial, and I suppose we could apply this to tax as well, many areas of policy, maybe the NHS, if you're going to do something controversial, you might as well really go for it. Because probably the strength of the response and the opposition is going to be there, whether you're really radical or only a little bit radical.
I'm sure that's right. And I think you need to start from scratch. You need to get rid of the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. Unfortunately, everything that's been done is an amendment of that act.
Right.
And therefore you have the basic skeleton from 1947. And that was straight socialism. At the point that act was passed, it was thought that the government would do all the development and own all the land that was built on.
Yeah.
And of course that bit fortunately didn't happen, but nonetheless that's how it was planned. It was for government control of the whole process. But you make a very good point. Not only should you be radical and get the whole hog if you think it's worth doing, but you've got to do it straight away.
Right.
And you've got to have your legislation written. Because Boris comes in 2019, he would like to do planning reform. He has that as an idea, puts it in the manifesto. You then have a period of trying to work out what that reform should be. You then have to turn that reform into legal instruction so that the parliamentary draftsman can get on and write the law. They then have to write the law. It's a particularly complex area of law. So you've gone then through all the way through COVID. You've gone through 2 or 3 secretaries of state. You've finally got Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister before the bill is actually being completed.
Yeah.
And it's fundamentally changed from where it started. And
that's how the sausage is.
That's how the sausage is made. But actually, you need to know what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And so you get elected in 2019, and in December and by January we've introduced the bill that sets out what we're going to do.
Yeah. And so that's the work that has to be going on now, effectively, if some future government is going to succeed in this area.
Absolutely right. They need to be working out. Now is the time when people like you, the think tanks, should be working out what should the policy be. And then in the period before the election, the leader of the opposition needs to decide what the policy is and basically get the draft bill prepared privately so that it's ready to go when the government is elected, run 2 years in, by which time you've lost a by-election and everyone's getting a bit nervous.
All right. I'd like to finish by asking you about the future of the right in Britain. Now, at the moment, if you look at the opinion polls, the parties to the right of centre are pulling out at 48%. It's split between two parties, of course. But I don't really want to ask you about the personalities involved or the political realities of it, not least because there's a local election just around the corner. What I'm interested in is whether a successful right in Britain can be stitched back together, and I mean philosophically. Could you come up with an agenda that unified those disparate groups on the right in British politics? And I suppose most importantly, if you could do that, would the outcome be a free market one, an individualist one, or would it be much more economically nationalist? Would it become collectivist, even authoritarian? Longer term, where does the future of the right lie?
I speak to quite a few conservative associations. I was amused to see that Robert Jenrick was being accused of stirring things up by addressing quite so many conservative associations, and then noted that I dressed just as many in a similar time frame. I find it's a really important thing to do. I enjoy doing it. And I find that the people I meet at conservative associations hold the sort of views about politics that the IEA advocates, that they are conservative, but they're economically conservative as well as socially conservative. You're probably not quite so socially conservative as the bulk of conservative members. And this seems to be where reform is as well. So I think there's enormous intellectual overlap. You ask a fascinating question, particularly in the context of nationalising steel, about whether the economics that wins the Red Wall is right-wing or left-wing. And here, I think you need to understand how we got to where we got to, that we didn't need to nationalise British Steel, we just needed to have a sensible energy policy. But when you haven't had a sensible energy policy, you then find you might have to nationalise something. It is a consequence of failed policy rather than something you would do if you had good policy. If you can get a proper energy policy, then your economic policy becomes much easier because other than taxation, energy is the most important driver of economic growth. And we have deliberately sabotaged economic growth, and the Conservatives are responsible for this too, since the Climate Change Act of 2007 or 8, whenever, 2008, I think. Yeah. But I should be able to.
It dragged on a bit.
And then the Energy Act that was passed last year, which just compounded it, and Theresa May's statutory instrument that said net zero by 2050, which is completely potty. So I wouldn't see the response to British Steel as being the advocacy of a very left-wing policy. I would see it as a response to other policy failures. What I think the right broadly needs to do is what it's always done that has brought together the coalition that has been a winning coalition. And I'm looking to Disraeli and I'm looking to Margaret Thatcher in this, that both of them appealed to a much broader electorate than the widely considered to be Tory. And let's use Tory as the term to cover both Reform and the Conservative Party. Because I think Reform are basically Tories and the Conservative Party is basically Tory as well. And how do you do that? You offer them things that will make their lives better. You help them improve their standard of living. And the reality is that the thing that will most help them improve their standard of living is good economic policy, and good economic policy has to be right-wing policy because we've tried left-wing economic policy and it's failed. But actually both Disraeli and Margaret Thatcher did an enormous amount on housing. Artisan Dwellings Act, sale of council houses. You have 110 years between them, but you have the same absolute focus on making sure your new voters' standard of living is improved through having good housing. So if we can get housing right, economic policy must be right-wing. Left-wing economic policy fails, as even Rachel Reeves may finally be beginning to notice. And therefore, if you try left-wing economic policy, you will not win the successive election because people won't be better off. But housing is very, very important.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about the issue with steel, I'm reminded of, I think this is Ronald Reagan, if it moves, tax it, if it keeps moving, regulate it, and if it stops moving, nationalise it. We've learned little.
We've learned remarkably little. And I was very briefly Energy Secretary and Business Secretary, the two were combined. And I dealt with Xingyi, the Chinese company I did, who I found were losing a lot of money, were being perfectly reasonable to deal with, wanted to keep the plant going, but were treated completely idiotically by the government. And they were asking me as business secretary to get them subsidies, whilst as energy secretary I was making their life impossible. And I wanted to change this so that as energy secretary I could take the emission trading scheme away from them. And the Treasury was having none of it. The Treasury preferred to hand out subsidies and put on a high tax on energy usage. It's absolutely idiotic. It's one of the reasons I think the Treasury is such a poisonous blob and dead hand on the body politic.
Well, there you go. What a great note to end on. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thanks for having me.